Chapter 5 of The Dinner Club by Sapper. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The soldier's story being a bit of orange peel. "You can set your minds at rest about one thing, you fellows," began the soldier with a grin. "My yarn isn't about war. There have been quite enough lies told already about that performance, without my adding to the number. No, my story concerns peace soldiering, and strangely enough, I had an ocular demonstration when dining at the Ritz 2 nights ago that everything had finished up quite satisfactorily in the approved storybook manner. At least, when I say quite satisfactorily, there was a price, and it was paid by one of the principal actors. But that is an unchangeable rule. One can but shrug one's shoulders and pay accordingly. The regiment, I was a squadron leader at the time, was quartered at Merchester. Not a bad station at all. Good shooting, very fair hunting, especially if you don't scorn carted stag, polo, and most excellent cricket. Also some delightful houses in the neighbourhood, and as we'd just come home from our foreign tour, we found the place greatly to our liking. London was an hour and a bit by train. In fact, there are many worse stations in England than the spot I have labelled Merchester. The only fly in the ointment when we first arrived was a fairly natural one, and a thing which only time could cure. The men were a bit restive. We'd been abroad, don't forget, for more than 10 years. India, Egypt, South Africa. And the feel of the old country under their feet unsettled them temporarily. Nothing very bad, but an epidemic of absence without leave and desertion broke out, and the officers had to settle down to pull things together. Continual courts-martial for desertion don't do a regiment any good with the powers that be, and we had to stop it. Of course, one of the first things to look to when any trouble of that sort is occurring is the general type and standard of your NCOs. In my squadron they were good, though just a little on the young side. I remember one day I discussed the matter pretty thoroughly with the squadron sergeant major, an absolute top-notcher. "They're all right," he said. "In another 2 or 3 years there will be none better in the British Army, especially Trevor." "Ah, Sergeant Major," I said, looking him straight in the face, "you think Trevor is a good man, do you?" "The best we've got, sir," he answered quietly, and he stared straight back at me. "You weren't so sure when he first came," I reminded him. "Well, I reckon there was a bit of jealousy, sir," he replied. "His coming in from the Link Regiment over a good many of the chaps' heads. But he's been with us now 3 months, and we know him better." "I wish I could say the same," I answered. "He defeats me, does Sergeant Trevor." The sergeant major smiled quietly. "Does he, sir? I shouldn't have thought he would. That there bloke Kipling has written about the likes of Trevor." "Kipling has written a good deal about the army," I said, with an answering smile. "Mulvaney and Company are classics." "It's not Mulvaney I'm meaning, sir," he answered. "But didn't he write a little bit of poetry about gentlemen rankers out on the spree?" "Why, yes, he did." I lit a cigarette thoughtfully. "Is Trevor his real name?" "I don't know, sir." And at that moment the subject of our discussion walked past and saluted. "Sergeant Trevor," I called after him on the spur of the moment, and he came up at the double. I hadn't anything really to say to him, but ever since he'd joined us, he'd puzzled me, and though, as the sergeant major said, the other non-commissioned officers might know him better, I certainly didn't. "You're a bit of a cricketer, aren't you?" I said, as he came up. A faint smile flickered across his face at my question. "I used to play quite a lot, sir," he answered. "Good. We want to get games going really strong." I talked with them both, squadron shop, a bit longer, and all the time I was trying to probe behind the impassive mask of Trevor's face. Incidentally, I think he knew it. Once or twice I caught a faint gleam of amusement in his eyes, a gleam that seemed to me a little weary. And when I left them and went across the parade ground towards the mess, his face haunted me. I hadn't probed, not the eighth of an inch. He was still as much a mystery as ever. But he'd got a pair of deep blue eyes, and though I wasn't a girl to be attracted by a man's eyes, I couldn't get his out of my mind. They baffled me. The man himself baffled me, and I've always disliked being baffled. It was a few nights after, in mess, that the next piece in the puzzle came along. We had in the regiment, he was killed in the war, poor devil, a fellow of the name of Blenton, a fairly senior captain, and his chief claim to notoriety was as a cricketer. Had he been able to play regularly, he would have been easily up to first-class form. As it was, he periodically turned out for the county. But he used to go in first wicket down for the army. So you can gather his sort of form. It was over the port that the conversation cropped up, and it interested me because it was about Trevor. As far as cricket was concerned, I hardly knew which end of a bat one held. "Dogface has got a winner," I heard Blenton say across the table. I may say that I answered to that tactful sobriquet, for reasons into which we need not enter. "One Sergeant Trevor in your squadron, old boy." He turned to me. I was watching him at the nets to-night. "Is he any good?" I asked. "My dear fellow," answered Blenton deliberately, "he is out and away the best bat we've had in the regiment for years. He's up to army form." "Who's that?" demanded the commanding officer, sitting up and taking notice. "Sergeant Trevor in B Squadron, Colonel," said Blenton. "I was watching him this evening at nets. Of course, the bowling was tripe, but he's in a completely different class to the average soldier cricketer." "Did you talk to him?" I asked curiously. "I did, and he struck me as being singularly uncommunicative. Asked him where he learned his cricket, and he hummed and hawed, and finally said he'd played a lot in his village before joining the army. I couldn't quite make him out, Dogface. And why the devil didn't he play for us out in Joburg?" "Because he only joined a couple of months before we sailed," I answered. "Came with that last draft we got." "Well, I wish we had a few more trained in his village," said Blenton. "We could do with 'em." After mess, I tackled Philip Blenton in the anteroom. "What's your candid opinion of Trevor, Philip?" I demanded. He stopped on his way to play bridge and bit the end off his cigar. "As a cricketer," he said, "or as a man?" "Both," I answered. "Well, my candid opinion is that he learned his game at a first-class public school," he replied. "And I am further of the opinion, from the few words I spoke to him, that one would have expected to find him here and not in the sergeant's mess. What's his story? Do you know? I don't. I shook my head. Haven't an idea. But you've confirmed my own impressions. And there I had to leave it for some months. Periodically I talked to Trevor, deliberately tried to trap him into some admission which would give me a clue to his past. But he was as wary as a fox, and as close as an oyster. I don't know why I took the trouble. After all, it was his business entirely. But the fellow intrigued me. He was such an extraordinarily fine N.C.O., and there was never a sign of his hitting the bottle, which is the end of a good many gentlemen rankers. Moreover, he didn't strike me as the kind of fellow who had come a cropper, which is the usual cause of his kind. And then one day, when I least expected it, the problem began to solve itself. Philip Blenton rang me up in the morning after breakfast from a house in the neighbourhood where he was staying for a couple of 2-day matches. Could I possibly spare Sergeant Trevor for the first of them? Against the I.Z., who had brought down a snorting team, and Carter, the Oxford Blue, had failed the local 11 at the last moment. If I couldn't, they'd have to rake in one of the gardeners, but they weren't too strong as it was. So I sent for Trevor, and asked him if he'd care to play. I saw his eyes gleam for a moment. Then he shook his head. "I think not, thank you, sir," he said quietly. "It's not quite like you to let Captain Blenton down, Trevor," I remarked. "He's relying on you." I knew it was the right tone to take with him, and I was very keen on his playing. I was going out myself that afternoon to watch, and I wanted to see him in different surroundings. We argued for a bit. I knew he was as keen as mustard in one way to play, and after a while he said he would. Then he went out of the office, and as it happened, I followed him. There was an old cracked mirror in the passage outside, and as I opened the door he had just shut behind him, I had a glimpse of Sergeant Trevor examining his face in the glass. He'd got his hand so placed that it blotted out his moustache, and he seemed very intent on his reflection. Then he saw me, and for a moment or two we stared at one another in silence. Squadron leader and troop sergeant had gone. We were just 2 men, and the passage was empty. And I acted on a sudden impulse and clapped him on the back. "Don't be a fool, man," I cried. "Is there any reason why you shouldn't be recognized?" "Nothing shady, Major," he answered quietly. "But if one starts on a certain course, it's best to go through with it." At that moment the pay sergeant appeared, and Trevor pulled himself together, saluted smartly, and was gone. "I suppose these things are planned out beforehand," went on the soldier thoughtfully. "To call it all blind chance seems a well-nigh impossible solution to me, and yet the cynic would assuredly laugh at connecting a child eating an orange in a back street in Oxford and the death while fishing in Ireland of one of the greatest-hearted men that ever lived. But unless that child had eaten that orange and left the peel on the pavement for Carter, the Oxford Blue, to slip on and sprain his ankle, the events I am going to relate would, in all probability, never have taken place. However, since delving too deeply into the cause and effect inevitably produces insanity, I'd better get on with it. I turned up about 3 o'clock at Crosby Hall, along with 4 or 5 other fellows from the regiment. Usual sort of stunt, marquee and lemonade with whiskey in the background for the hopeless cases. The I.Z. merchants were in the field, and Trevor was batting. There was an Eton boy in with him, and the score was 200 odd for 5 wickets. Philip Blenton lounged up as soon as he saw me, grinning all over his face. "Thank heaven you let him come, old man. He's pulled 80 of the best out of his bag already, and doesn't look like getting out." "He wouldn't come at first, Philip," I said, and he stared at me in surprise. "I think he was afraid of being recognized." A burst of applause greeted a magnificent drive past Cover Point, and for a while we watched the game in silence, until another long round of cheering announced that Sergeant Trevor had got his century. As I've said before, I'm no cricketer, but there was no need to be an expert to realize that he was something out of the way. He was treating the by no means indifferent I.Z. bowling with the utmost contempt, and old Lord Apson, our host, was beside himself with joy. He was a cricket maniac. His week was an annual fixture, and for the first time for many years he saw his team really putting it across the I.Z. And it was just as I was basking in a little reflected glory that I saw a very dear old friend of mine arrive in the enclosure, accompanied by a perfectly charming girl. "Why, Yeverley, old man," I cried, "how are you?" "Dog-face, as I live," he shouted, seizing me by both hands. "Man alive, I'm glad to see you. Let me introduce you to my wife. Doris, this is Major Chillum, otherwise Dog-face." I shook hands with the girl, who was standing smiling beside him, and for a while we stopped there talking. He was 15 years or so older than I, and had left the service as a captain, but we both came from the same part of the country, and in days gone by I'd known him very well indeed. His marriage had taken place 4 years previously while I was abroad, and now, meeting his wife for the first time, I recalled bit by bit the gossip I'd heard in letters I got from home. How, to everyone's amazement, he'd married a girl young enough to be his daughter. How everybody had prophesied disaster, and affirmed that she was not half good enough for one of the elect like Giles Yeverley. How she'd been engaged to someone else and thrown him over. And yet, as I looked at them both, it struck me that the Jeremiahs had, as usual, been completely wrong. Certainly nothing could exceed the dog-like devotion in Giles' eyes whenever he looked at his wife. We strolled over to find some easy chairs, and he fussed round her as if she was an invalid. She took it quite naturally and calmly, with a faint and charming smile, and when he finally bustled away to talk to Apson, leaving me alone with her, she was still smiling. "You know Giles well?" she said. "Awfully well," I answered, "and having now returned from my sojourn in the wilds, I hope I shall get to know his wife equally well." "That's very nice of you, Dog-face." She turned and looked at me, and by Jove, she was pretty. "If you're anything like Giles, you must be a perfect dear." Now, I like that sort of remark when it's made in the right way. It establishes a very pleasant footing at once, with no danger of misconstruction, like getting on good terms with a new horse the moment you put your feet in the irons, instead of messing around for half the hunt. Anyway, for the next 10 minutes or so I didn't pay very much attention to cricket. I gathered that there was one small son, Giles Junior, who was the apple of his father's eye, and that at the moment a heavy love affair was in progress between the young gentleman aged 3 and the General's daughter, who was as much as 4, and showed no shame over the matter whatever. Also, that Giles and she were stopping with the General and his wife for a week or 10 days. And it was at that stage of the proceedings that a prolonged burst of applause made us look at the cricket. Sergeant Trevor was apparently out. How, I hadn't an idea, and was half-way between the wickets and the tent next to the one in which we were sitting, and which Apson always had erected for the local villagers and their friends. I saw them pick up 125 on the board as Trevor's score, and did my share in the clapping line. "A fine player, that fellow," I said, following him with my eyes. "Don't know much about the game myself, but the experts tell me—" And at that moment I saw her face, and stopped abruptly. She had gone very white, and her knuckles were gleaming like the ivory on the handle of her parasol. "Major Chillum," she said, and her voice was the tensest thing I've ever heard, "who is that man who has just come out?" "Trevor is his name," I answered quietly. "He's one of the troop sergeants in my squadron." I was looking at her curiously, as the colour slowly came back to her face. "Why? Did you think you knew him?" "He reminded me of someone I knew years ago," she said, sitting back in her chair. "But of course I must have been mistaken." And then, rather abruptly, she changed the conversation, though every now and then she glanced toward the next tent, as if trying to see Trevor. And sitting beside her, I realized that there was something pretty serious in the wind. She was on edge, though she was trying not to show it, and Trevor was the cause, or the man who called himself Trevor. All my curiosity came back, though I made no allusion to him. I was content to await further developments. They weren't long in coming. The house team, with a respectable total of 350 odd, were all out by tea-time, and both 11s foregathered in the tent behind. All, that is, except Trevor, who remained in the other until Apson himself went and pulled him out. I watched the old man, with his cheery smile, take Trevor by the elbow and literally drag him out of his chair. I watched Trevor, in his blue undress jacket, smart as Bedan, coming towards us with our host, and then, very deliberately, I looked at Giles Yeverley's wife. She was staring over my head at the two men, then she lowered her parasol. "So you weren't mistaken after all, Mrs. Giles," I said quietly. "No, Dogface, I wasn't," she answered. "Would you get hold of Giles for me, and tell him I'd like to get back? Say I'm not feeling very well." I got up at once and went in search of her husband. I found him talking to the Zingari captain and Sergeant Trevor. He seemed quite excited, appealing as he spoke to the IZ skipper, while Trevor stood by listening with a faint smile. "What he says is quite right, Sergeant Trevor," remarked the Zingari man as I came up. "If you cared to consider it, you are absolutely up to the best county form. Of course, I don't know about your residential qualifications, but that can generally be fixed." "Dogface," cried Yeverley as soon as he saw me. "He's in your squadron, isn't he? Well, it's so long since I left the army that I've forgotten all about discipline, but I tell you here, right now, in front of him, that Sergeant Trevor ought to chuck soldiering and take up professional cricket. Bimbo here agrees with me. "Giles, you'll burst your waistcoat if you get so excited," I remarked casually. "And incidentally, Mrs. Yeverley wants to go home." As I said the name, I looked at Trevor, and my last doubt vanished. He gave a sudden start, which Giles, who had immediately torn off to his wife, didn't see, and proceeded to back into the farthest corner of the tea-tent. But once again old Apson frustrated him. Not for him the endless pauses and waits of first-class cricket. 5 minutes to roll the pitch, and he was leading his team into the field. Trevor had to go from his sanctuary, and there was only one exit from the enclosure in front of the tent. They met, Mrs. Giles and Trevor, actually at the exit. By the irony of things, I think it was Giles who caused the meeting. He hurried forward as he saw Trevor going out, and caught him by the arm. Dear old chap! He was cricket mad if ever a man was, and so blissfully unconscious of the other, bigger things going on right under his nose. "Don't you forget what I said, Trevor," he said earnestly. "Any county would be glad to have you. I'm going to talk to Major Chillum about it seriously." And I doubt if Trevor heard one word. Over Giles's shoulder he was staring at Giles's wife, and she was staring back at him, while her breast rose and fell in little gasps, and it seemed to me that her lips were trembling. Trevor went out to field, Giles bustled back to his wife, and I, being a hopeless case, went in search of alcohol. The soldier paused to light another cigar. "He carried out his threat, did Giles, with regard to me. 2 or 3 days later I lunched with the General, and it seemed to me that we never got off the subject of Trevor. It wasn't only his opinion. Had not Bimbo Lawrence, the I.Z. captain, and one of the shrewdest judges of cricket in England, agreed with him? And so on, without cessation, about Trevor the cricketer, while on the opposite side of the table, next to me, sat his wife, who could not get beyond Trevor the man. Once or twice she glanced at me appealingly, as if to say, 'For God's sake, stop him!' But it was a task beyond my powers. I made 1 or 2 abortive attempts, and then I gave it up. The situation was beyond me. One could only let him ramble on and pray for the end of lunch. And then he left the cricket and came to personalities. 'Know anything about him, Dog-face?' he asked. 'Up at old Ashton's place. He struck me as being a gentleman. Anyway, he's a darn nice fellow. Wonder why he enlisted.' 'Oh, Giles, for goodness sake, let's try another topic,' said his wife suddenly. 'We've had Sergeant Trevor since lunch began.' Poor old Giles looked at her in startled surprise, and she gave him a quick smile which robbed her words of their irritability. But I could see she was on the rack, and though I didn't know the real facts, it wasn't hard to make a shrewd guess as to the cause. It was just before we rose from the table, I remember, that she said to me, under the cover of the general conversation, 'My God, Dog-face, it's not fair.' 'Will you tell me?' I answered. 'I might help.' 'Perhaps I will some day,' she said quietly. 'But you can't help. No one can do that. It was my fault all through, and the only thing that matters now is that Giles should never know. I don't quite know why she suddenly confided in me, even to that extent. I suppose with her woman's intuition she realized that I'd guessed something, and it helps to get a thing off one's chest at times. Evidently it had been an unexpected meeting, and I cursed myself for having made him play. And yet how could one have foretold? It was just a continuation of the jigsaw started by that damned bit of orange peel. As she said, all that mattered was that Giles, dear old chap, should never know. The soldier smiled a little sadly. So do the humans propose, but the God that moves the pieces frequently has different ideas. He did, that very afternoon. It was just as I was going that two white-faced nurses, clutching two scared children, appeared on the scene and babbled incoherently. And then the General's groom hove in sight, badly cut across the face and shaky at the knees, and from him we got the story. They started off in the General's dog-cart to go to some children's party, and something had frightened the horse, which had promptly bolted. I knew the brute, a great raking black, though the groom, who was a first-class whip, generally had no difficulty in managing him. But on this occasion, apparently, he'd got clean away along the road into the town. He might have got the horse under control after a time, when, to his horror, he saw that the gates were closed at the railway crossing in front, and it was at that moment that a man, one of the sergeants from the barracks, had dashed out suddenly from the pavement and got to the horse's head. He was trampled on badly, but he hung on, and the horse had ceased to bolt when they crashed into the gates. The shafts were smashed, but nothing more, and the horse wasn't hurt. And they'd carried away the sergeant on an improvised stretcher. No, he hadn't spoken. He was unconscious. "Which sergeant was it?" I asked, quietly, though I knew the answer before the groom gave it. "Sergeant Trevor, sir," he said, "B Squadron." Is he badly hurt?" said the girl, and her face was ashen. "I dunno, mum," answered the groom. "They took him off to the orspital, and I was busy with the 'orse." "I'll ring up, if I may, General," I said, and he nodded. I spoke to Purvis, the R.A.M.C. fellow, and his voice was very grave. They'd brought Trevor in, still unconscious, and though he wouldn't swear to it at that moment, he was afraid his back was broken. But he couldn't tell absolutely for certain until he came to. I hung up the receiver and found Mrs. Giles standing beside me. She said nothing, but just waited for me to speak. "Purvis doesn't know for certain," I said, taking both her hands in mine. "But there's a possibility, my dear, that his back is broken." She was a thoroughbred, that girl. She didn't make a fuss or cry out. She just looked me straight in the face and nodded her head once or twice. "I must go to him, of course," she said gravely. "Will you arrange it for me, please?" "He's unconscious still," I told her. "Then I must be beside him when he comes to," she answered. "Even if there was nothing else, he's saved my baby's life." "I'll take you in my car," I said, when I saw that she was absolutely determined. "Leave it all to me." "I must see him alone, Dog-face." She paused by the door, with her handkerchief rolled into a tight little ball in her hand. I want to know that he's forgiven me." "You shall see him alone, if it's humanly possible," I answered gravely, and at that she was gone. I don't quite know how I did it, but somehow or other I got her away from the General's house without Giles knowing. Giles junior was quite unhurt, and disposed to regard the entire thing as an entertainment got up especially for his benefit. And when she'd made sure of that, and kissed him passionately, to his intense disgust, she slipped away with me in the car. "You mustn't be disappointed," I warned her as we drove along, "if you can't see him alone. He may have been put into a ward with other men." "Then they must put some screens round him," she whispered. "I must kiss him before... She didn't complete the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. We didn't speak again until I turned in at the gates of the hospital, and then I asked her a question which had been on the tip of my tongue a dozen times. "Who is he, really?" "Jimmy Dallas is his name," she answered quietly. "We were engaged. And then his father lost all his money. He thought that was why I was so beastly to him. But, oh, Dogface, it wasn't at all. I thought he was fond of another girl, and it was all a mistake. I found it out too late, and then Jimmy had disappeared, and I'd married Giles. Up at that cricket match was the first time I'd seen him since my wedding." We drew up at the door, and I got out. It's the little tragedies, the little misunderstandings, that are so pitiful, and in all conscience this was a case in point. A boy and a girl, each too proud to explain or ask for an explanation, and now the big tragedy. God, it seemed so futile. I left her sitting in the car, and went in search of Purvis. I found him with Trevor. I still thought of him under that name. And he was conscious again. The doctor looked up as I tiptoed in, and shook his head at me warningly. So I waited. And after a while Purvis left the bed and drew me out into the passage. "I'm not sure," he said. "He's so infernally bruised and messed about. His left arm is broken in 2 places and 3 ribs, and I'm afraid his back as well. He seems so numb, but I can't be certain." "Mrs. Yeverley is here," I said. "The mother of one of the kids he saved. She wants to see him." "Out of the question," snapped Purvis. "I absolutely forbid it." "But you mustn't forbid it, Doctor." We both swung round, to see the girl herself standing there behind us. "I've got to see him. There are other reasons, beside his having saved my baby's life." "They must wait, Mrs. Yeverley," answered the doctor. "In a case of this sort, the only person I would allow to see him would be his wife." "If I hadn't been a fool," she said deliberately, "I should have been his wife." And Purvis's jaw dropped. Without another word, she swept past him into the ward, and Purvis stood there gaping, gasping. "Well, I'm damned," he muttered, and I couldn't help smiling. It was rather a startling statement to come from a woman stopping with the G.O.C. about a sergeant in a cavalry regiment. And then, quite suddenly and unexpectedly, came the final turn in the wheel. I was strolling up and down outside with Purvis, who was a sahib as well as a doctor, and had asked no questions. "If his back is broken, it can't hurt him," he had remarked, "and if it is, it'll do him good." At that we had left it, when suddenly, to my horror, I saw Giles himself going into the hospital. "Good Lord, Doc!" I cried, sprinting after him. "That's her husband, and he doesn't know she's here." But a lot can happen in a few seconds, and I was just a few seconds too late. As I got to the door, I saw Giles in front of me, standing at the entrance to the ward, as if he had been turned to stone. A big screen hid the bed from sight, but a screen is not sound-proof. He looked at me as I came up, and involuntarily I stopped as I saw his face. And then, quite clearly from the room beyond, came his wife's voice. "My darling, darling boy, it's you, and only you, for ever and ever." I don't quite know how much Giles had guessed before. I think he knew about her previous engagement, but I'm quite sure he had never associated Trevor with it. A year or two later she told me that when she married him she had made no attempt to conceal the fact that she had loved another man, and loved him still, and Giles had taken her on those terms. But at the time I didn't know that. I only knew that a very dear friend's world had crashed about his head with stunning suddenness. It was Giles who pulled himself together first. Giles, with a face grey and lined, who said in a loud voice to me, "Well, Dog-face, where is the invalid?" And then he waited a moment or two before he went round the screen. "Ah, my dear," he said, quite steadily, as he saw his wife. "You here?" He played his part for 10 minutes, stiff-lipped and without a falter. Then he went, and his wife went with him to continue the play in which they were billed for life. Trevor's back was not broken. In a couple of months he was back at duty, and so it might have continued for the duration, but for Giles being drowned fishing in Ireland. The soldier stared thoughtfully at the fire. He was a first-class fisherman, and a wonderful swimmer, was Giles Yeverley, and sometimes I wonder. They say he got caught in a bore, that perhaps he got cramp. But, as I say, sometimes I wonder. I saw them, Jimmy Dallas, sometime Sergeant Trevor, and his wife, at the Ritz 2 nights ago. They seemed wonderfully in love, though they'd been married 10 years, and I stopped by their table. "Sit down, Dog-face," she ordered, "and have a liqueur." So I sat down and had a liqueur. And it was just as I was going that she looked at me with her wonderful smile, and said, very softly, "Thank God, dear old Giles never knew, and now, if he does, he'll understand." The soldier got up and stretched himself. A big result for a bit of yellow peel. End of chapter 5.